Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. Karl Burkart is the Deputy Director of OneEarth and formerly the Director of Media, Science and Technology at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. OneEarth's science program supports academic institutions and NGOs working on the cutting edge of climate and energy science, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable food systems. Through grant-making and development capacity, the program helps to turn science into action, empowering decision-makers in government, civil society, and the private sector. In this episode, Karl shares his path towards working in climate, and we discuss his very early years in activism. We elaborate on the power of storytelling, and you will hear what happens when a bunch of futurists meets in order to discuss climate. We deep dive into renewable energy transition, conservation and restoration, and regenerative agriculture. We further discuss the importance of biodiversity and why it is so vital to include nature and not only the climate into the discussion and our actions. You will learn practical and hands-on tools to make a change in your front yard and on a global level. Wonderful. And with that, Karl, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
How do I feel? Well, for me personally, this is a year of trying to focus and scale back a bit, because I have been running nonstop like a maniac since before the Copenhagen climate conference in 2009, and it feels like been a mad dash all the way through COVID. And then in COVID, I strangely got busier because we had two major massive publications come out that were years in the making, influencing two different UN conventions. And that was just how it worked out. So I was doing, constant, just nonstop meetings and events on to inform those important conventions. And so yeah, and that was throughout COVID pretty much. And then we had the Glasgow summit, and then the Montreal summit, which just wrapped last December, and kind of like we made it through. And then I as I mentioned, I had some personal life things with my mom passing away, so I had to sort of slam on the brakes for a couple months. And in the middle of that time, so I've been doing lots of thinking about focus and like how does someone, because climate, of course, which I've been working on for 20 plus years, it's like a myriad, it's realms within realms of interesting possibilities, important research that has to be done. And there's 1,001 different trajectories one could take in their career working in climate. So, and we at OneEarth tried to really focus it to 3 pillars, but those 3 pillars are, I say, it's like I'm laughing because they're also each so huge. So the three pillars of OneEarth are three sort of pillars of action to solve the climate crisis and limit warming to 1.5 C. Is renewable energy transition, nature conservation and restoration, and the third one is regenerative agriculture. So we like took a whole bunch off the table, just focusing on those three. But each of those three turns out to be, of course, a huge universe unto itself, and we fund and develop research in all three of those. And so yeah, so now it's like at some point, and I'm hitting my middle age, and just yeah, what am I really thinking about mortality, and who knows how many years we have left, and what's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of my time. And that's a lot of my thinking that I've been going through. So it's an interesting moment for me. But I think I'm done with a nonstop marathon. Yeah.
No, it very much sounds like an interesting moment, and I think it's good you're done with the nonstop marathon. And yeah, we're going to look into those three pillars in more depth for sure. But Karl, you mentioned that you've been in climate for more than 20 years. What brought you into climate initially?
Well, I was a little activist when I was in elementary school. And so I kind of think I just had it in my DNA somehow. And I was part of the Save the Whales campaign in the 70s as like a little kid. And I think, like a lot of kids, my entry point was thinking about just like life on Earth and the diversity and complexity of life, and that we have to protect it. That's really where the starting point was. And then I graduated high school early, and I got a degree to study physics, and a scholarship. And at the time, I was very excited about new nuclear energy. And this is really dating me, because there was some very interesting early research in fusion, and I learned then, like really relatively young, that fossil fuels were heating up the greenhouse. We call them the global greenhouse back then, and that nuclear fusion is going to be will absolutely positively be the energy of the future. So I was like thinking, oh, I want to work on that. And and I was pretty smart, but I wasn't that smart. I do not have a genius IQ. So, and even then, now we've seen 30 years on, we're just now beginning to see a few breakthroughs. Like just last year, right? We got the first net positive output of a fusion reactor. So we're early days. But yeah, that's kind of how I started. And then I realized I wanted to like make things. I wanted to do something in the physical world. So I decided that architecture would be the way for me to try and have an impact. So I also was raised in New Mexico. I went high school and middle school in New Mexico, and that was kind of the epicenter of solar. So a lot of solar innovation was happening. And what I was quite excited about was how solar energy changed the form of architecture, and how does the built environment embrace better ways of managing our world, and incorporating this free, abundant resource, which is shining down on us all the time, especially in New Mexico. It's shining nonstop. And how does that change, building structures and engineering? So that's what I got my master's in, and I went and I started out and went to the Bay Area, and that was right when LEED was happening, before it had launched. So that LEED, if you guys don't know, your audience doesn't know, that was the green building, the first kind of big green building alliance, and it was the first standard for like what is a green building. And I was very involved in that and did a lot of large institutional projects. And then at some point I just was like, this, and if if you're an architect, a normal like 5 years is a fast project, so I felt like everything was just like too slow. And then I got an invitation to join a environmental startup in Los Angeles. So I moved down there and thought, well, maybe this internet architecture thing, which it was very early back then, maybe the architecture of information is a better way to make change. So that's how I ended up. And then, like we were talking about just before, like I started a blog called Green Dig, which was then acquired by kind of a spin-off of CNN, just focusing on all things climate, environment, technology, energy, and nature. Kind of just sort of became everything that I covered. I was writing like, I think I wrote 700 articles or something like that. And I started getting a little more activist-y as well, and really researching, the pitfalls of nuclear energy in its current form, which we should all be very thankful for, because otherwise we'd probably all be dead because of the warming would have been. It has saved us a lot of warming, but it's also filled with problems, and that was also when all the big misinformation campaigns were really taking off. With big firms like Edelman getting hired to kind of create like fictional campaigns to validate fossil fuels, which of course were the cause of climate change. So I was kind of in the info wars, like the early days of the information wars and PR campaigns trying to validate fossil fuels. So yeah, I got in a lot of heat. I would get death threats on my blog all the time towards the end. Yeah, it got really scary, actually. People like on the comments, "I'm gonna find you, like and kill you," and yeah, it was. So anyway, that's kind of like that's when like my journey to what I'm doing now.
You talked about activism a couple of times. What role does activism play in your everyday life today?
Great question. I was invited to a TED Talk this year. So, on TED, you have to describe yourself in 3 words. It's really, which is a very hard exercise, because normally you describe yourself as your title of your organization, which you're not allowed to do. So I can't say deputy director of OneEarth. So I started playing with an activist was one of the first words that came to mind. And then I looked and I saw how many people say they're activists. And I'm like, I don't think they're an activist. And we work with activists, like we actually support, especially youth activists. And, I don't do that anymore. I don't march. I don't lock myself in. I don't do hunger strikes in Nancy Pelosi's office. One of our climate fellows did the hunger strike. And so I don't feel like I can say any more than I'm an activist, although I think other people would say I am. In my words, I guess in my writing, I try to be. I feel like I have an activist spirit. I just don't know if that counts. You know what I mean? I'm not getting arrested. I'm not like Jane Fonda. So I actually decided, instead of activist, to take the word futurist. And that was a very difficult decision, and I had some time to think about it because I was sort of off of work in this kind of mini family sabbatical, and I kind of landed, and I had been invited by the Salzburg seminar. Are you familiar with Salzburg? They do these really cool seminars in this castle in Salzburg, and I was strangely, someone found my writings and invited me to a summit on futurism. And so it was futurists from around the world came, and they according to them, I'm a futurist. So I was like, okay, I'll take that one on. I think futurist is maybe a bit more, because my world is a lot in the written word, and trying to really create the envelope of possibility that we can occupy and step into. And I feel like that's a different energy than an activist, which is really like bashing back the evil monster, honestly. And I did that for many years, and the evil monster bashed back. And at some point you just, it's taxing, and you kind of, or is this really what I'm good at, kind of thing. And so I think I've kind of shifted from activist to futurist, but I still have an activist spirit. I don't mind picking a fight online if I have to.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. And before we maybe talk about One Earth in a bit more detail, I would be very interested. What happens if a bunch of futurists comes together, and what is it that you discuss?
Well, it was really fascinating for me too. I mean, it's everything. There were a lot of people working in the arts, actually. So there was a group of artists working sort of like in new technologies and what those possibly can reveal about the human body, about the mind, culture. I actually and I have kind of, having lived in Hollywood for 13 years, very interested in the role of media in shaping our picture of the future. So Black Panther had just come out, and so I was really intrigued by the architecture of Wakanda in that world. So we had a really interesting conversation around that. There were a bunch of people in the museum world. So there's I think it's in Berlin, a museum of the future that was being created. So there was people there around that. And then, there was a group of us that were kind of really there to talk about global climatic systems and what is the biophysical nature of the world that we'll be living in, and how do we adapt to that? How do we relate to that? And so it was really interesting. I mean, those seminars are incredible. So it was a very unusual group of people that would normally never meet. But really, it's about we need to be predictive about the future, not just responsive and reactive. And, there's a bit of, we have to give ourselves the space, and we have so much that's being thrown at us all the time, politically and socially and technologically. But we have to push some of that back and give ourselves a space to think about what is the future we actually want. And that is a discipline, and there are people that get PhDs in it. It's really, really interesting. And there's it goes back to really I mean, I think futurism's been around a long time, but it kind of became a discipline and proper in the 60s, 70s, Buckminster Fuller, a lot of those leaders and pioneers. But yeah, in some ways we're all futurists. We just, whether it's we give ourselves time to express it or not. And that is one of the big decisions we made at OneEarth, was that we wanted this to be a future-facing brand, a future-facing initiative that is not about looking back and dealing with the things of the past. Of course, we have to engage with it, but that the primary essence of it is about moving forward, and what are we gonna, how thoughtful and how much are we gonna design that space that we're stepping into, or how much are we gonna just let ourselves fall into the abyss of the future that's currently being created for us?
And let's use that and talk about One Earth a little bit. And if I use some information from the website, it reads, One Earth is a non-profit organization working to accelerate collective action to solve the climate crisis through groundbreaking science, inspiring media, and an innovative approach to climate philanthropy. The solutions for the climate crisis already exists, and the latest science led by One Earth shows we can achieve the critical 1.5°C goal through our 3 pillars of collective action, basically what you already mentioned earlier. Do you want to tell us a little bit in your own words what One Earth does and what you do there?
Yeah, well, One Earth is a relatively small team. I think we're probably 16, 18 full-time, semi-part-time people. But we have a huge network, and this is a network we've developed over, we worked in the philanthropy world for, now since going back way till 2007. We've done, our team is, my co-founder, Justin Winters, and I have sort of led over 100, I think at this point it's about 120 million in grants, mostly to on the ground projects around the world, 60, 70 countries. So it comes from a philanthropic background of like, how do you, well, first of all, what's the role of philanthropy in all the types of capital that are trying to seek to change the world in some way? And then what's the best way to deploy that? How do you effectively deploy that with the biggest impact? And that's social and environmental impact as well. So a lot of what we did is develop systems to cut out middlemen, and try to get funding on the ground as close as we could to kind of like say like the front lines of the climate crisis. And that's kind of where it comes from. That was a huge job. But then we realized that there were a lot to answer the question about how do you most effectively deploy capital, you have to start going into models. Like, what models of knowledge and information are you using to inform those decisions, right? Is it just because, you're in the right place at the right time, God anointed you somehow with some sort of magical gifts to like, place capital here or there? No. And, like, this is in the investing world too, there's some people that think they have magical gifts, but most of the really smart people they have really good models. And so we thought, okay, well, we had access to hundreds of scientists. We were involved in creating several documentaries, including Before the Flood, which was Leonardo DiCaprio's documentary in 2016. And we were sort of looking at all the social media around that. And that was very like doom and gloom. Like, this is climate change. It's really bad, right? That was the whole thesis of the film. Nothing on solutions, really. And the feedback online was, well, what are the solutions? Who's got the roadmap? Tell us what to do. How do we help? Is this hopeless? Because it feels hopeless based on the movie. And so we were like, okay, well, we have access to all these hundreds of scientists. So we started asking, and no one had the model. Couldn't believe it. This was now 2017. So this is like the film came out 2016. So Johan Rockström, everybody, like, no one had, how do we do 1.5C without novel technologies that don't yet exist? And we had done some prior research. We had funded some research on renewable energy, global renewable energy transition. So we knew it was, from an engineering perspective, it was possible, but yet a model hadn't yet been created to really like show how to do it without sort of all this novel technology. So that's actually what created the OneEarth model, which is the OneEarth is the namesake of the OneEarth climate model, which ended up coming out was a big scientific collaboration I put together, and mostly Germans, scientists and engineers and energy modelers and some physicists, to really greenhouse gas modelers, to like really put together a comprehensive model. And there was a key piece in that on the role of nature. And that was like also before, nature climate solutions had really taken off. Like, no one was really talking about that. We were very interested in the role of nature in sort of additional sequestration, because even at that point, back in 2017, 2018, 2019, when the book came out, so the book, it was all published in this massive 500-page book called Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement Goals. Version 2 of that just came out last year, by the way, with an updated model. But the role of nature, it was clear then that just transitioning to renewable energy alone, we just couldn't do it fast enough to avoid 1.5C. So we also needed the natural climate solutions. And there was also almost no peer-reviewed literature on that. There was sort of like bits and bobs out there, some references in some literature, but a lot of not peer-reviewed literature and some NGO initiatives, but nothing that had been peer-reviewed as the technical, like from an engineering perspective, what's the technical potential of nature to like help us out in this transition? So that was a key element in that. yeah, and that is, so that kind of, all of that unlocked the science program. So back to your question, what do I do? I mean, I'm the deputy director, so I oversee like all the operations in some capacity, but really mostly focused on this advancing the science and policy agenda. So like we do that through funding research on our own, and or getting funders together to collaborate to get models put out to inform decision makers. Yeah, so an example of that is, the version 2 of the OneEarth model. A lot of the institutional asset owners needed a model to inform their decision making on how are the big asset owners going to transition their portfolios to a Paris aligned or net zero portfolio. So they chose, our model was chosen because it kind of was at the most advanced at the time to really work some of those questions out. So that's kind of like the idea, like how do we call it actionable science? Like how do we get science into the hand of decision makers? And then we do that also across, nature, the conservation agenda as well. And then we also do have a media program, which I'm really proud about, and it's kind of like humming along in the background. We have about 150,000 followers on our social channels, and we have a cool little small but really great media team that tells stories about a lot of the work that's being done around the world. And I always wish we had, we're always stretching our budget like as massively as possible, but they do quite a lot, and we help other NGOs in their campaigns. We put out a lot of sort of informational videos and a lot of articles on important things that are happening. So those are kind of how the three programs are organized.
What role do you think plays storytelling, and I may add optimistic storytelling, in the climate crisis?
Well, right. Storytelling is where it's at. I mean, there's all this talk, like, obviously we work in climate, so carbon is kind of like the metric that a lot of people use for success. Did it reduce carbon? Did it absorb carbon? But that misses so much, and a lot of the projects, that we have been able to give direct money to, a lot of times it'll be an indigenous tribe, working on a court battle to get their land rights back, and you can't measure, how do you measure that in carbon? We get asked this all the time, like, you're a climate initiative, but yet when I click into so we have this thing called the Project Marketplace under a philanthropy program where, unlike many other philanthropic institutions, we let everyone see the projects that you can see it all there, including the projects we haven't funded that we want to fund. So those are all on the marketplace, and people can scan through that and see all these projects. And I think we're up into 40 or so different countries, 135 projects now. And none of them really have a carbon KPI, because everyone else is doing that. You've got investment bankers now coming in trying to do carbon projects. You'll see on our website, it's a very human focused approach. So it's really looking at the community and the leader level, what they're doing. And so you get into all of this other stuff, like how it's empowering the community politically and how it's helping them economically. Like, so there's a lot of development woven in, and they are climate projects. They are in some way, either adapting or mitigating climate change, but they are really at the center, like an inspiring story of a community or individual who's really taken leadership to like do something that needs to be done. And so telling that story, actually, it's really hard work. But I think it's really important because we've seen people reacting to the marketplace, and we've had companies and, banks and wanting to work with us because there is media there's actually assets. You can see photos and videos and hear a quote from the leader of the tribe or whatever. And there's a there. And that often there means like it is local, like it actually is an on the ground project, but it's very tangible. Who's running it? Why are they running it? What need is it responding to? What challenges do they have to overcome? So all the great stuff in storytelling that you learn in Hollywood. And our vision has always been that we want to have a great story told for every one of the projects, but it is an absolutely huge amount of work. As we've been doing this for a long time, and it is, so many of these communities are really like marginal. They are really being battled economically, climatically, politically, and asking them to shoot some video, or a recorded interview. We've tried. It's really, really hard to get them to do that, because they just have so much else they have to deal with, and that's something we want to solve in the future. We really feel like telling the stories of these communities is really important.
No, and I can imagine that good storytelling, or storytelling initially also helps you to secure funds and philanthropic revenue streams, is it not?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think it's whether it's, we look at all the sort of strata of philanthropy. We have this kind of interior tagline: everyone is a philanthropist. Like, even if you have no money, you can be a philanthropist through volunteering, for example. But you have like sort of like individual philanthropy, like normal people like us. Then you have corporate, and then you have kind of high net worth family offices, and all of them need stories to understand, and the stories kind of help them understand the tangible aspects of the project, and also kind of ground themselves in where the money is going, even if it's quite hard to we've gotten asked this, like, we can't say that money went to like buy 65 hammers and timber to do X, Y, and Z, like, or buy four cows, to graze this one area, like that. Getting down to that level, we don't yet have the technology or infrastructure to do that, but with the story, you're able to kind of paint the picture of like how those resources are getting used. So it really helps a lot.
No, it sounds like. Thank you very much for the elaboration. And I would like to take a look at those three major pillars of action. And you described them earlier, but they are renewable energy transition, conservation and restoration of nature, and regenerative agriculture. So if we start with renewable energy transition, what role does such play in our climate crisis?
Well, it is the solution. I mean, there is roughly 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases are from land use change, but all the rest is from energy and industry. So the big question, that's the number one thing to tackle, is like, how do you decarbonize the way we power and fuel our civilization? And there were, in the early, we funded research way back, I think now going back to like 2014, on 100% renewable, just through wind power, water, so hydro and solar. That was done out of Stanford. And that the idea there was that everything would have to go electric. And the question was, could you power all future energy demand electrically, through these three means? And so that was the analysis done. That was done by a physicist. So it wasn't an energy modeler, and the energy modeling community really pushed back on that, because there was, in California, it was in Stanford, there were a lot of pro-nuclear people that really felt like nuclear was a huge part of the solution. That was before the financials of nuclear. That was before they became impossible, which has happened now over the past 5 years. I guess you could say the financial case for renewables collapsed. But there's a pushback on that. And actually that's why in the new model, we wanted what emerged is something you probably heard, your audience probably heard, just transition. And so we've talked, I worked with some of the labor unions in Europe around this topic. And if you want to think about so we need a renewable energy transition, right? That doesn't require burning of stuff to make ends meet. But you also have to take into account all the jobs and the economic stability that fossil fuels have given us, right? So all the people working in those industries have to have a just transition. That's what just transition means. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but the original meaning of it was, how are we going to get like labor unions who often are vested in the fossil fuel industry? How do we get them a just transition into the renewable energy economy so they're not left behind? All the stories that the conservative politicians love to tell about the poor coal miners who are now destitute because nobody wants their coal. So, we like to make fun of it, but really that's valid. We need to get those coal miners jobs, right? Like, we can't just abandon all these people. And there's a lot of people that work in the fossil fuel industry. So that was really the just transition. So we were like, okay, well, 100% electrical transition is going to leave a lot of people out of the picture. So what started emerging is this kind of more complex renewable energy transition that's a more just transition. So that's looking at a lot broader offerings on the table and different types of modalities of energy delivery. So electrons are one way to deliver energy, but we also have liquid fuels and we also have gas fuels. And a lot of our gas fuels provide heat. And that's heat for our homes and heat for our industries. And then the liquid fuels often provide us mobility. Now, is it hypothetically possible to electrify everything and get rid of all these other energy carriers? Maybe, yeah, but is that a just transition? I don't know. So we actually wanted to, so OneEarth model really got into the weeds on, I think I should know the number off the top of my head. I'll count them in a second, but we looked at a much larger spectrum of electrical carriers. So things like wave power, hydrogen even. There's an interesting story around hydrogen power. And then we looked at the kind of heat carriers. So that could be sustainable biomass, which is like, say, crop residue, biomass that maybe even is either getting burned or landfilled. How could that become a source of heat? And even solar thermal, which is actually what I was interested in way back when I was a young architect. We can convert the sun's rays into power thanks to Einstein and solar panels. But we can also just directly take the heat and use that in a building. And that actually lowers the demand for solar panels, which is good because you don't need as many minerals and all that kind of stuff. So that wasn't even looked at, right, in that earlier Stanford study. So there's and geothermal is another huge one, both for power and for heat. And then when you get into fuels, how are you going to get jets? We're still going to have airplanes. I know we don't like airplanes. They really emit, a lot of fossil fuels, 2 to 3% of global emissions. But, you need basically the stability of a liquid fuel to ensure that those planes are going to get from point A to point B. So we need liquid fuels as well. So the OneEarth model then really opened it up and looked at all of these different renewable. And to my knowledge, it's the most comprehensive. Like, a lot of models just sort of cherry pick a few solutions. We look at all of them.
How is it a collective action needed? If we talk about the energy transition, and you are now based in the US, but you've mentioned a couple of countries in the European Union as well. How is it something that needs to happen on a global scale, and how can this happen if we talk about solutions?
Well, collective action. Yeah, we have that. it's kind of our ethos, are we delivering on it yet? I don't know. Like we're really exploring that question right now. There isn't as there really isn't very good apparatus for collective action right now. And we've made many attempts actually in the past. And I used to work for the GCCA, which ran this campaign called Tick, 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 which was like the largest group of NGOs working on climate. I would think it was up to close to 500 NGOs. We tried to do a platform there across all, and we're talking about NGOs almost from every country, all these language groups. And we ran this action center, so we'd have petitions and things people sign. At the end of the day, it's what we realized is it's really hard to do collective action if you don't agree on the roadmap. And because then it's like everyone's, so 350 at some point made a pivotal decision that they were going to focus in on stopping new fossil fuel development, stopping pipelines, stopping new coal projects, things like that, with Sierra Club. And that's great, right? Like, so they ended up creating for themselves in their pocket community, a focus and but that wasn't like the roadmap to the future, right? That was like, of all of these 85 bad guys, our new mission is to bash at these 3 bad guys. That's not a vision for the future, my friend. And it's and while it is motivating and activating for those true activists at heart who don't, like Jane Fonda, like we were saying, like who don't mind getting arrested, and that is a theory of change, like you do get press and it does make a difference and people do notice, but that's not doing this other part of the job, which is, well, we know what we hate. What do we want? We know what we don't want. What do we want? And then you ask, and honestly, I've seen, and God bless her, I've seen Greta, put on the spot on this a lot, because as a teenager, she became basically the most high profile climate sort of advocate. And she's like, I'm a teenager, I don't know, like she's very genuinely answering when like these journalists would say, well, what is the vision of the future? What do you want? She's like, that's not up to me. And I don't blame her, but that's where we're failing right now, is that like the movement doesn't actually have that. We're starting to get the 100% renewables there was a lot of people fighting that, by the way, even in the civil society area and civil society arena, I mean, and some of the labor folks and things like that. So there was a long, hard battle to get to 100% renewables. Everyone pretty much agrees on that, but it's not like it's sort of been translated into a vision of the future. It's sort of just like a talking point or sort of a policy position. And then some people are, well, is nuclear renewable? We do not consider nuclear to be renewable because it requires constant mining for inputs. That's like our definition. There's no circularity or recycling of the inputs. So there's a bit, the Swedes and the French, and there's groups that really think nuclear is a renewable, right? So it's still not totally worked out yet, but largely we've kind of won that narrative battle, and that a lot of people do reference our model in that. And our model, by the way, does include the role of nuclear all the way to 2050. But it's phases it out just because it's just too expensive. So I would say the collective action part, we're kind of almost not, we're getting ready for it, but right now we don't have the overarching unifying vision of what our collective action is going to, that's my personal feeling. Like, I mean, I think we could say collective action, like let's shut down, I was seeing the kids in Tennessee. I don't know if you guys in Europe are following this amazing thing where all these, the gun control situation in the US is just insane. Like, and these kids took over the Capitol building in Tennessee. And, it's inspiring. Like we could just try to have our unifying thing is we're just going to take over all of these halls of power, but then what are we going to tell them? What are we going to say? Like in the case of gun control, it's very clear, no more guns. We want guns to be banned. So that's a very simple, clear policy position. When you get to climate change, you have to, as you know, like we have a taxonomy, the OneEarth taxonomy, which we've been rolling out. We have 76 different solution sets, each of which have their own policy levers. So it's a bewilderingly complicated thing. It's not just like, yeah, I think we can all agree that teenagers shouldn't have automatic weapon rifles, but in Tennessee, they can't agree to that. So, that's why collective action is not just simply fighting the man. We have to be ready. If we were to ever succeed and take over everywhere, what are we asking everyone to do? And that's why we've been investing so much in these models, because it's like, we need to be able to eventually come to kind of agreement on the future that we want. So I would say, yeah, to answer your question, like we're not quite there yet. We're starting to create some systems on, and there's some secret projects working on to try and help get scale sort of volunteerism and philanthropy at the micro scale. I think that's probably going to be our first entree into this, but it needs software, and we don't have the software. Doesn't exist right now. And blockchain, I studied that for a long time, and DAOs and cryptocurrencies and things like that, and we thought that might be an avenue, but that it really is kind of putting the cart before the horse, or sort of a rocket ship before the horse. We're not as a society, we don't even have the basics in place, much less the hyperledger technology is not going to just magically make all the other problems go away. So yeah, the platforms and the software and the systems don't yet exist for collective action, but that is something we want to work on.
No, and I do agree that therefore storytelling, narratives, and information are so important, right? To create this common roadmap, vision, whatever we want to call it, in order then to bundle each and everybody and say, okay, this is our collective roadmap, our collective action, and this is how it can look like. I would like to take another look at conservation and restoration of nature. And based on the Living Planet Report 2022 by the World Wildlife Fund, better known maybe as WWF, wildlife populations plummet by 69% since 1970. What are your thoughts on the loss of ecosystems?
Yeah, so what's weird about OneEarth is everything I just described around the complexities of renewable energy, there's an equal complexity around our relationship with nature, and how dependent upon those systems we are. And we are just such a sort of technophilic civilization. Like we just are obsessed with technology, and the idea that sort of technology keeps moving things forward. And I've seen this when I started out in the early days. When you talked about climate, you would get in trouble if you talked about nature. And still to this day, there's a whole cohort of the climate, kind of what you'd say the climate activist world, really thinks nature just we shouldn't even be talking about it, because really primarily we need to focus on all this energy and industry transition. That's all true, but like we also can't not think about the biological systems that make our bodies alive. And so what's very unusual at OneEarth is we actually took these two agendas and we sort of smashed them together in a certain way under the OneEarth climate model, because we're like, we don't have time to just only work on renewable energy, and then we'll get around to figuring out, oh, at that point we'll all be dead. The whole societies will have collapsed, because like it does, like I always say, it's like it doesn't really matter if we solve climate change if we have no biodiversity. And I will defend this position in a second. If we have no biodiversity present in the natural in natural landscapes and seascapes, lands and oceans, it won't matter that we've solved climate change, because life will collapse. We won't have the pollinators for our crops. We won't have the functioning water sheds to supply the water for our cities and our agriculture. We'll lose our carbon pump, because actually we've been funding some really advanced research in this, like all of the little critters in the forest are actually what keeps the forest healthy and absorbing carbon. So it's so interesting, because I had to explain this to another scientist working in a different field last week, and I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't seem to get through that, like in all of the climate models, we'll share. I mean, I think you've seen our climate model, but I'll reshare in case you want to look at it. But it is more or less assumed that nature, it will continue functioning in the background, absorbing roughly 50% of the carbon dioxide we put out every year. And there's more advanced models now that we used Magic 7, which is one of the most advanced. It's a rapid way to really look at complex interactions of greenhouse gases. But now we know that that's not true. Nature will not just continue absorbing 20 gigatons. Right now, nature roughly absorbs roughly half, which is roughly 20 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide in terms of like permanently, right? It doesn't re-release that 20, it doesn't exhale that 20 gigatons. It just inhales it and stores it. Roughly half in the oceans, roughly half in forests and other landscapes. Everyone just assume, climate scientists that's just in the background. They're like, that's in the background. That's just we don't worry about that. Well, guess what? Like now there's all this research showing we really need to worry about that, because there are many, they're called biosphere feedbacks that result from warming. So, and they're incredibly complex. Some all the way from more forest fires to permafrost emissions. So when the permafrost is thawing, it's actually releasing different methane and carbon dioxide in a variety of different ways. And we have the paper on that we supported. Also, what happens to the oceans when it warms? Do carbon sinks collapse? Does it absorb more? Does it absorb less? There's all this complexity around how nature responds itself to climate change. And we cannot assume that's just this little magical machine working in the background. And that was it took me a long time to get my head around that when I was getting involved in the climate modeling world, because it was like, wow, this is, it's advanced. So the new big IPCC report, the summary report just came out, but that was based on 3 reports that came out earlier. It is advancing. So in this report, we now have governments were lobbying against even including this. But now we have it accepted in the canon of science that yes, our biosphere feedbacks, there's a variety of them, they will affect. But going back to the biodiversity question, like the little animals, I have this talk I give where I have a picture of a tiger, a pelican, a tapir, and an elephant. And it's like, what do these have to do with climate change? And then it's such a fascinating, exciting realm of science that's kind of just starting. But all of these animals are vitally important for the carbon cycle. So there's some really interesting science. It's called Animating the Carbon Cycle. You can look up that paper. A new paper just came out that we supported that shows just even bringing back populations of 3 species, that's forest elephants in Africa, bison, and baleen whales, you can get almost an additional billion tons of sequestration per year. That's how, and that's just 3 species. We know from a paper that we supported that came out last year on large mammal assemblages, there's 20 plus species that major herbivores and carnivores that could be brought back, like wolves and many other beavers and all kinds of other creatures that also will have huge carbon potential when you add it all together. So animals, we know from that they're vitally important in how forests, like an example, like a forest elephant breaks a trunk off of a tree or a branch off of a tree, eats the leaves, leaves the wood, moves on, clears some airspace and some light. And what happens is that's net positive carbon cycling. So the elephants make way for the photosynthesis to increase. And so actually you see this net accumulation of carbon because of the presence of forest elephants. So if you look at a protected area, a protected park in a forested park in Africa with elephants and without elephants, the one with elephants does more carbon cycling. And this goes all the way down the food chain, down to even microorganisms in the soil. So it's like, we have to understand this. Like, this is like, there's 8 billion humans, and that's come at the loss of, we can't even count them, how many tens of billions of species have died since I was born. Like you said, there's only 30% of the little precious hearts that were on the planet when I was born are still on the planet. So we've wiped off all those beating hearts, those little birds, those insects, fish, and all of that affects our food and it affects our carbon cycle. So that's how the agendas are really deeply integrated. And it's weirdly still kind of controversial, and it's kind of edgy science, but I predict, and I think I've sort of decided myself that I need to focus more in on this second pillar of the role of nature in solving climate change, because it's just there's so much more work needed in that space.
What makes you hopeful to bring back some of those species and creatures that you're talking about? What are ways to do so?
There's successful examples, and actually we have some great, going back to storytelling, we have a great story of the wolves of Yellowstone, which is a great video up there. If you just Google wolves of Yellowstone, you'll probably find the video. And there are many case studies. There's getting to be more peer-reviewed literature coming out now on this topic, and including the stuff we're supporting. So I'm quite convinced. We always take a friendly skeptic. Like, that's my job. So there's a bunch to unpack here under this conservation pillar. But let's just talk about the restoration piece for now, since you asked about it. There were some wild numbers being thrown out in the early days of like how much, when you looked at the historic loss of carbon from landscapes, and if you took a very simplistic approach, you could say, well, we lost all that carbon from those landscapes, we can put it all back. So that's where you get into your trillion tons of carbon, right? That's not going to happen. Like, a lot of that land is used for agriculture or cities or industry. A lot of it is collapsed into desert, cannot be brought back no matter what we do. And, a lot of it has been just effectively terraformed into something else. And so we actually supported a group of scientists to what we're calling like right size the technical potential of carbon removal from one type of biota, so trees, and through 5 different pathways, so 5 different kind of mechanisms, and to really get a solid number on what that potential is. And that took years to do, and a really amazing group of women scientists put that together using, it's called dynamic vegetative modeling. So they kind of actually project out warming and how that might interact, carbon cycles in different kinds of forests. And so we landed on roughly 100 gigatons of carbon. So that's solid carbon, or 360 or so gigatons of carbon dioxide that can be absorbed through tree restoration. So that's reforestation and tree planting and things like that. But that's just the part of it. That's like one aspect of it. Then again, when you bring back the species, and that's called rewilding, where you kind of, you could try to plant you sort of build it and they will come idea is how we used to think of it, where it's like, well, let's just make the habitat nice like it used to be and all the creatures will come back. Largely, that's kind of true, actually. They often will magically just come back. Even Manga Bay, which is one of my favorite outlets on nature, like they always have these amazing stories of these, like when sort of things kind of grow back, and there's natural regeneration as one of the 5 pathways I mentioned, where basically you let like a forest that's been clear cut, you just leave it alone and let it come back and do its thing. That species that everyone thought were gone, were extinct, come back. Or they find them and they were like, wait, we thought this was extinct 30 years ago, and they find them in the field. So we know there is magic, like the species will come back, but we can also assist and accelerate that process by trying to reintroduce what's called the trophic structure of the ecosystem, which is who eats who. And when you restore normal levels of predation, so you have predators and the herbivores that they prey on, they over millennia or millions of years maybe evolved to create a stable carbon environment. So we can actually accelerate that and bring that back in a generation instead of 1,000 years. So that really is exciting. And those stories are very, they do give you hope, because it's just wonderful. Like, when you have a mating pair of endangered, red monkeys that you thought weren't there anymore, and you see them and then they're having little babies, suddenly you just feel like there's hope.
No, absolutely. No, thank you very much for sharing those hopeful stories. And that leads me to the third pillar, Karl, that I would like to talk about, and that is regenerative agriculture. And my first question would be, what is regenerative agriculture, before we talk about its importance and such?
Okay. So I will define that, and then I need to answer that by going back to part of pillar 2, which is conservation of ecosystems, because the two are, in my mind, inextricably linked. Especially those 2 pillars. You can't do regenerative agriculture without functioning natural ecosystems surrounding the farming area. So you actually need proximity to nature for regen ag to work. The thing is, there's not a whole lot of peer-reviewed literature on regen ag and defining it. We actually put out a really important paper with a bunch of scientists trying to do that, because there was a lot of pushback on it. Sort of like 2020, World Resource Institute kind of attacked it as like not really a viable climate solution. It shouldn't be included as a climate solution. It should be included as sort of an adaptation, resilience, sustainable smallholder farm development angle. But they didn't want to talk about the carbon, because really, I don't blame them, because the science wasn't out, and it's still not. I mean, there are some pieces of science that have come to validate, but we're nowhere near. We're in the early days on peer-reviewed literature around regenerative agriculture. But we know from centuries of people doing it that it works. But we have, lots of anecdotal evidence on the efficacy of regenerative agriculture, which is essentially an agriculture that doesn't rely on, if you want to take the most extreme version of it, it's permaculture. So, which is, there are no external inputs required. The area you're farming, and maybe just the area right around it, provides you everything that you need for that farm to be ever self-sustaining and ever renewing. You don't need to bring in toxic chemicals. You don't need to bring in foreign plants. You don't need to bring in foreign fertilizers or chemical fertilizers that aren't as stable in the soil and leak out and mess up your water supply. You don't need to bring in water. So that's like the hardcore version, right? It's that, and the reality is, if in many ecosystem types, and we have a whole biogeographical taxonomy as well. Like there are 185 bioregions according to our definition, which is based on over 800 ecoregion types. Depending upon your ecoregion type, that can hold true. That purely by being, having your chickens and trees nearby and hedgerows and cover crops that you can plant that then bring nitrogen in and fertilize, and you collect your water, and you have swales so it doesn't flood, but you can use it later. Like there's a whole myriad of practices in many ecosystems that does work. But, I think we're taking a bit more of an open-minded approach to regenerative agriculture at a global level, at a systems thinking level. And I believe I love all of that stuff that I just described. And I took 3 semesters when I was getting my master's in urban farming. And so I have a long love of, and I grew up on a farm in upstate New York. So I have a love of farms, and I really believe all that stuff is true. But I think we also have to look and embrace a broader set of solutions. So we have a very, in our taxonomy, we have 27 different regenerative agriculture solutions, including, by the way, we have 3 that are in the apparel, clothing, because we're to talk about agriculture, it's mostly food, but it's also what we wear. So we do have a kind of a subset of solutions around regenerative fashion and fabrics and things like that. But for the most part, and so I have on there solutions like, potentially the role of agritecture, so that's a very high tech that the regen ag people don't like this, but it actually, if you think about it, like if we have to get more food delivery capacity and nutrition delivery in urban centers, we have can we use the urban fabric to actually grow a lot of that food? That's the question with agritecture. Like, can we integrate farms onto our buildings, or can we make, can we do hydroponic skyscrapers? We don't know yet. Like, LEDs are very cheap now and very low, very energy efficient. You can solar power them. So, we can make mini suns inside of a building and to grow certain types of crops, especially leafy greens, which is what's critically lacking in a lot of food deserts in cities. Like especially low-income people can't get access to those leafy greens. So like maybe that's a solution there. So we have a broader definition, but I want to go back to this idea. If you were to only think about the hardcore hippie version of regen ag, it takes more land. So then we get back to pillar 2. It bounces the tennis ball back to pillar 2, which is conservation. Because we can't just convert all of the natural forests and wetlands and wild grasslands that we have to regenerative farms or any kind of farm. We can't just keep chopping down nature to have more farm fields. That's not sustainable. That's not regenerative. So that's why that knocks you back into the conservation agenda, which, I was just in Montreal during the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and the 30 by 30 target was adopted, which was great. A lot of people had worked at that. That's actually, a lot of people don't know, that's based on a paper we put out. Goes way back. We were the first to publish peer review paper on 30 by 30 target, and the larger target we felt was needed, which is actually 50. So you have to kind of have roughly half the planet in some form of sort of natural integrity for both biodiversity and carbon cycling. So if you look at biodiversity alone, you kind of, in the study, you could infer that you can get away with 30%, but we actually need more to do all of it: carbon cycle, hydrological cycles, and things like that. So so that we're really have to defend that territory. And who's coming after that territory? It's agriculture mostly. A lot of that's really bad agriculture. That's like mowing down forests to grow cattle feed so that people can eat more red meat, right? So that's bad. But it's also being mowed down for some like good farming too, right? And also it's being mowed down in some cases for solar panels, which is insane. Like in India, they clear cut a side of a hill that was south facing, which is one of the last ancient forests in this one area. It's the area I spent time in India. And it was devastating because they did it to put solar panels. So obviously, like that's why we have to look at all three together, because we need to defend the conservation territory, and we need to add to it through restoration to get up to the level of this at least 30 in the next decade or so. And then we need to keep expanding it from there. And then, so then we go, if we do that, we get to like put one of the chess pieces in place, right? So let's now optimize where that is. And now we move back into the agriculture space and look at the whole myriad tapestry of different kinds of solutions available. Some of which uses artificial intelligence to help you figure out, like, should I plant rye here or should I plant hard wheat here? Should I plant sorghum, or should I not plant anything actually, and actually use that as a wetlands for my pollinators so that they can pollinate my crops? Like, this is where the future of agriculture is going. And there's actually some super exciting stuff happening in artificial intelligence and modeling to help farmers figure that out. And we're talking about old school mainstream industrial farmers are wanting to embrace this, because it means they have to import less fertilizer and they can create higher yields with less water, and they can get more for their crops, right? So who doesn't want that? So now even in the Midwest of the US, which you'd say is maybe the most conservative area in America, the hardcore conservatives are there. They all want to start doing this regenerative agriculture thing because they're hearing about other people making more money with it. So that's kind of like the complexity that we have to look at around it. But that was a long answer to what regenerative agriculture is, but I think you can't answer it any other way. It's not just planting clover, over your crops and having some chickens. And we can, I don't know if you post this up on the website, but we have taxonomy we can share that shows all of the different solutions. We're even kind of, some people don't like some of the solutions we've included, but we just feel like we have to look at them scientifically because they're investment opportunities and they could really make a big difference, because eventually we have to feed 9 billion people. We know that. And by feeding, that's just not empty calories. We've got to actually provide nutrition. So we, on the third pillar, we actually have a model we're supporting at University of Minnesota on that topic. So like, how do we feed? What is the optimal way to feed 9 billion people? We're starting to try and get into the modeling on the agriculture side. It's quite a lot harder actually than all of the other types of models we talked about.
It sounds like. So do you think that regenerative agriculture basically has the potential to transform, and some may call it broken food system that we have currently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is the solution. I don't think we're gonna, and you can define our broken food system in a lot of ways, but I don't see any other way out of it. And, we've got there is a role to play for the agriculture industry. Unlike what I said earlier, there is not a role to play of the fossil fuel industry in the energy transition. Period. The story. Like that tweet I mentioned, that was before we started recording, but there are only two options in the fossil fuel industry. Either the fossil fuel company becomes a renewable energy company or it goes out of business. Those are the only two things in old school fossil fuel industry needs what they need to do. And on the agriculture side, I do think there's a role for industrial ag, especially in providing those staple calories. But it's hugely wasteful. I mean, it is really like they love all these papers and they love to talk about how they're optimizing yields, and it's a humongously, exorbitantly expensive, wasteful way of producing calories. There's a lot of room for improvement to make industry better. So growing wheat better, and I think, and that might involve maybe intercropping. So that's like maybe introducing two crops rather than just one, or introducing tree cropping, which is where instead of these giant fields of flat corn fields that go on for 100 miles, you actually break that up with tree breaks, and those then start to provide other value that you can use. So I think there's going to be like some hybrid industrial solutions that are going to be part of the future. But I think I think it's only going to be part like where industry is not going to solve our food crisis. They've actually, if you read on our website the history of the Green Revolution, the chemical, industrial agriculture is sort of synonymous with the chemical industry, right, coming to power sort of in the 50s, 1950s, and really peddling all these chemicals as a solution to get, have better yields. And we found, like in India, with Modi more or less banning now industrial agriculture in India because of all the humanitarian, all the pollution, all the kind of corrupt sort of cycle where you're relying on special seeds that you have to get from the same company, and every year those seeds don't work, and they need bigger, better chemicals to work with, and the whole Monsanto sort of the business model. We all know we're done with that. And even Bayer knows they're done. Bayer owns Monsanto. So we're all done with that. But I do think there's a role for some industry, but it's mostly like, how do you do these smallholder and medium holder farms more efficiently? And there's some key technologies to unlock that are on the verge but are missing. We can talk about those if you want, but there's a lot a lot of people ask me, like, well, what do you put philanthropy money in versus like investor money? A lot of the investment opportunities right now, and there are so many funds doing very well, and I know a lot of the people who manage those funds, they are investing in all of this kind of downscaling like appropriate technology to small and medium farmers and unlocking that. There's a big unlock. It's huge. It's probably the biggest unlock in the history of investing, is how you get this huge, I should have the number off the top of my head. I think it's roughly a third, of land surface is under some kind of cultivation. It's so wasteful the way it's done. Like, there's massive business, many thousands, if not millions, of business opportunities around unlocking the potential to get rid of that waste out of the system, using new technologies. And so it's an exciting place for investors, and there's a lot of investors playing in that world, because I think, that unlock is huge.
Thank you very much for all the elaboration. And in fact, I have a couple of questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, maybe for our audience listening, along those three pillars or anything else that comes to mind, of course, what are concrete steps or actions that each and everybody can take in order to partake in this action?
Yeah. Well, the first one is it's really no one will have a quick answer to this, I don't think. But it's like if now having done, and by the way, I built carbon calculators and lifestyle. Like we looked at, how much can you get out of your own personal lifestyle, and shifting to eating less meat and all that's good. I'm not gonna dismiss that. But I would say the number one thing is who you bank with, and finding out the climate exposure of your bank. Like how much is your bank investing in fossil fuel infrastructure? And it's a weird time for banking. Obviously, right now we got a war going on. We just had COVID, and now American banks and European banks are getting exposed for how corrupt they are. So there's all sorts of things going on. It's actually quite a good time to be thinking about your banking. I don't want to direct you specifically, but I will direct you to, there's a great report that comes out every year called Banking on Climate Chaos, if people don't know about that. They list the biggest banks and what their exposure to fossil fuel infrastructure. So basically what I said in some of my writing on Medium, you've seen that all of us are funding the climate crisis through our bank deposits. Because Citibank that funds a lot of I think it's one of the, I can't remember if it's number one or number two. It's one of the worst in terms of funding new fossil fuel infrastructure. They need our deposits in order to create the leverage to loan out to those fossil fuel companies to do that infrastructure work. So without our deposits, they wouldn't be able to do it. So I always like to say it's unfortunately, it's just regular everyday people who don't mean any harm that are funding the climate chaos we're in right now. So get really knowledgeable about your bank. I would say that's number one. And I would have said go to a regional bank or a credit union, but of course we now know those are also quite exposed to this strange inflation scenario that we're in. So you got to be really careful, but I guess I could I could tell you what I'm doing. I think I can probably safely say I've moved quite a bit of my money to a fintech company called Atmos, ATMOS, which is effectively acting as a bank that only does loans for solar development. And so they're actually paying a bit of a higher yield than a regular savings account because they're funding something pretty safe. And solar is going, and this is, I think right now it is US only. So I know you have a lot of folks, but there are equivalent in Europe. And there is actually a group coming together to try and do a campaign around switching banks to banks that don't invest in fossil fuels and then hopefully invest in renewables. So that's number one. Number two is I would say, do you know if your city has a climate transition plan? And just ask yourself that question. Start asking, is there a local chapter of the Sierra Club? They probably won't know. Has the city council published anything? Is your city working on a transition plan? And if so, what does it look like? Does it have lots of fossil fuel companies with magical carbon capture technology? Because if so, you need to fight your city council. And that's not just climate mitigation, that's also adaptation. Like if you're a coastal city or a city that's water stressed, what's the plan? We now have, the models are getting quite a bit better, so we know where water stress is going to occur. Is your city, does it have an integrated climate plan in the works? And if not, get really involved, because it's all what I'm seeing, having worked in this, like at the multilateral level, like the UN, working at national level, state level, or province level. The real action is happening at the city level. Because the cities, that's where you have your centers of sort of like liberal power or progressive power. And the cities they're the economic centers of the county or the province or whatever. So you can build power outward from the city and project that out. Also, that should include a conservation plan. So, and that's for biodiversity and for water and carbon. And there's been some attempts, like Google has a little tool that they were starting to experiment with. A company called Azavea, Azavea. They have a tool on city transition plans, but I'd say that's something we want to figure out how to support. And our model, unfortunately, it's a regional model. So it's a global scale model that is built from 10 regional models. So a region is like sub-Saharan Africa. So they're huge, right? We want to work on downscaling them. So because the models are really useful in terms of like how much solar, how much wind, how much hydro is available. And that's where you start, but getting that really hyper local transition plan, that's what I think the movement should be about, those two things. If you could only pick two. And then, if you want to get arrested and try to stop a pipeline or stop ancient trees from being cut down, I love you. That's great. You should keep doing that too. But I would say those are the two big ones.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I really also do like the get involved and do something, inform yourself, and then take action on a micro scale and be aware that this will also affect the macro scale so much. Karl, before we go to the last and final 3 questions of today's podcast episode, is there any topic or theme or thought that you deem we haven't discussed in great detail today and that you would like to shine light on?
No, we've covered a lot of ground, actually. I'm sure something will pop in my head, but let's keep going with the questions.
It's always good to have a reason to come back for a round 2 anyway. So the first of the final 3 questions, Karl, is what is it that makes you hopeful?
Well, I want to say I am, as much as we can complain and whine in agony about the UN process. The conventions that we just mentioned have really made a lot of progress, and people need to be aware of that. It was an absolutely Herculean feat, that the biodiversity convention, with all of the complexities of China being the president in this really strange time, it was able to get this conservation area target in place. I think it was really dicey for a while. I also think what happened in that convention is the role of indigenous people in particular. Like it's not our study, but we brought in another study to show that roughly a third, if not more, of all of that land I mentioned that we need to protect is under indigenous governance. So finally that has come up to the top, and the role of indigenous and native tribes in this whole picture is emerged. That's very exciting. And a lot of legal cases have been won recently. Just this morning, I got an email about a case in, I think it's Peru or Ecuador, on the rights of nature. So allowing nature to sue, essentially, to not be polluted. So we're starting to see legal innovations, policy innovations. And you have those broad sort of policy objectives, and then all of the understory has to move up. But that's the business, all the businesses, large and small, all of the NGOs, civil society. It is important establishing those top level kind of umbrella positions, and that has happened amazingly. And same with the climate convention, which the next one is going to be in UAE. The president of the COP is a fossil fuel executive who said who actually laid out the most progressive target I've ever heard of any COP in 28 years, which is that we need to triple renewables by 2030. I believe that's the talking point. So that really, I saw that and I was like, holy, that's amazing. Like, because 5 years ago, I mean, our model doesn't even call for tripling renewables. Like 5 years ago, we would have been laughed out of the room for saying triple renewables by 2030 or 10 within 10 years or something like that. And now you have the COP president who's actually a fossil fuel executive saying that. So, I mean, there are those things at the top level that are happening and the economics are, that has been really, this was the past couple of years. We're going to really see that the next couple of years. The increasing costs of fossil fuels and the decreasing costs of renewables, that X intersection has been crossed. Some would argue it was crossed in 2019, but it was kind of masked because of COVID. So we now are pretty sure that, there was a surge, of course, because of post-COVID and the war. And we've got this momentary craziness happening with oil trading, but it's all, even the International Energy Association is saying, well, that's actually going to drive the renewable transition faster than even we thought. And they are a very conservative organization, I will tell you, having battled with them for more than a decade. Like they have really come a long way. And so now we're seeing even the kind of mainstream, suit and tie people like the McKinsey types, really all they have to come along with the party now, essentially. So now what I think is going to happen is a lot of acceleration. It's like sort of like we're hitting the kind of really that last mile at the top of the mountain, and it's going to go really fast from here. So I would say, like, at the meta level, that's giving me a lot of optimism. And then just science is getting better, and we're getting clearer data so we can just make decisions more quickly. There's still a lot of work to do on that front, but I think that's giving me hope. And just the kind of people that are coming to us, because that paper I mentioned, the Global Deal for Nature and the Global Safety Net, which is a project we run, shows all the land globally that needs to be in some form of conservation. And we've had people that, coming to us for help, like, or wanting to use that data that I'm surprised by even. So I think everyone's, even industry and the ratings agencies, and we're seeing investors. Half of the invitations I get are to speak to investors now. So the fact that the financial community is on board, like, I'm just seeing and I've been at this a long time, let me just tell you, like, so I have to say, like, I'm seeing it, all the players that are finally late to the party are now in the party. Will it be fast enough? Probably not. Will we have huge, horrible impacts because of them coming to the party late? Yes, we will. But, the fact is the momentum is there now. So I'd say that's kind of the main thing.
Economics is also a strong narrative, I can hear. Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that. And the second of the three last questions would be, whom are your mentors and who do you personally look up to?
That's a great question. So many of the scientists I work with have taught me so much and been very patient with me. We're about to, like, expand our advisor network on our website. So I'd say you should go to our website and see all those people. But yeah, we've had some remarkable scientists that have really been generous, even though they're incredibly busy, helping us get clarity. And, I could name a few, but like Sven Teske, who kind of led the energy modeling work. And there's a guy, Stefan Schurig, who's at F20. So that's the Foundation's 20, which is kind of the civil society group for the G20. They've been really successful and proactive in like really pushing the renewables agenda, and kind of on the sort of at the foundation level. And foundations are very influential in governments, especially in across G20 countries, not just the US. They are influential in the US, but they're very influential in a lot of European and Middle Eastern countries. So that's been a huge thing that I've seen. On nature, Eric Dinerstein is our kind of chief scientist on the global safety net. So he's a legend and helped create the ecoregions framework, which we use. We've adapted for our framework and the global safety net. And Greg Asner is one of the scientists also on the global safety net, but he's doing really, really advanced satellite imagery work. So that's using hyperspectral, which is very complex lasers configurations to get actually chemical signatures coming off of the canopy. So like we can actually tell what's called beta diversity. So that's like communities of plants, which is very important. That's going to be the next chapter in ecological conservation. Is going to be spectronomics. So like actually seeing and understanding the interactions of communities of plants in the carbon cycle and hydrological cycle for biodiversity, all that stuff. And then on the regen ag stuff, there's just so many great people. We've been able to support some great folks. I'm trying to think of like a few that really stand out. Kind of a legend in the regen ag world is I think he's in his 90s. He's an Indian scientist named Dr. Lal, Lal. I think it's Prashant Lal, and he's been sort of at it the longest, looking at carbon, soil carbon, and carbon sequestration. Bruno Basso is a really interesting scientist who I kind of referred to earlier in the third pillar. He's using satellite imagery to help farmers understand where they're wasting money. And what I love about this is it's applying cutting edge science to a very basic economic need for farmers that in some cases are hardly even 8th grade level reading, but like helping them understand, like, you don't actually need to apply this much fertilizer. You actually shouldn't plant in this area. You should plant this in this area. So like that work has been really, really inspiring. There's just so many more on our website. So we're going to roll out this taxonomy of the way it's organized is there's the OneEarth climate model. There's the 3 pillars that we talked about. Each of the pillars has 4 sub pillars. So we'll have a lot of content there explaining different aspects of the transition. And then underneath those, we have all the solutions. So those are going to be authored or co-authored by scientists in many cases. So we're actually raising money to try. We thought we could just do it by ourselves, but we're just all too busy. So we're trying to raise money to get this out now because we want everyone to have the latest information on all of these amazing solutions. And those will be kind of authored by the cutting edge people in the field. And so I'm excited to get that out because then people can go and see some of the real like innovative thinkers, in the space.
Very much looking forward to that and also to share the results and get this positive voice out there. Thank you so much, Karl. The last and final question is a rather hypothetical one, and I call it the 3 truths. So I would like you to imagine that you're traveling all by yourself in space for actually quite some time. Could be a couple of months, could even be a couple of years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, and that species can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know humanity. What is it that you tell them?
They want to know what the 3 things are about humanity. Yeah. Well, we're very imaginative. And that imagination, do I have to elaborate on these? The imagination can be create beautiful things and horrible things. We have very big hearts, most of us. That means we care about others and we care about other living things, not just other people. I'd say we're also survivors. Survivors maybe is the other thing. So even when the absolute worst is thrown at us, that's usually when we're our best. So I think those are my three. Those come to mind. It's a good question. I definitely hadn't prepared that one, but yeah, I think those three.
Thank you very much. And yeah, maybe the imagination and the caring characteristics that we have helped us survive. So thank you very much, Karl, for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast today. And if there's any last and final words that you have for our audience today, it's all yours.
No, it's really fun. Great questions. I mean, I'd say definitely go check out our website, oneearth.org. We have an absolutely massive amount of content on there that people don't know about. I like periodically look at like our other climate websites, and there's not that many really. And they usually have like carbon calculator or a little thing here or there, but we have like literally encyclopedias of information on there. So pretty much we have a decent search bar. So any topic in those three pillars, you're bound to find some information on. Yeah, we're actually indexed quite well in Google as well. So you could just search in Google and add OneEarth. You'll probably find some great stuff. What's the other? Yeah, I would say, yeah, and then maybe, I know I gave you three actions to get going. I gave you two really. And then I was thinking, well, actually the third is something I'm working on, which I think maybe I don't know if this fits with your audience, but I'll say it anyway because it's helping me, which is I've converted my front little lawn into a pollinator garden, which by the way was really hard. And I'm trying to figure out how to make it easier for people, but really get to know like 10 species that are from your ecoregion. So you can go on our website, find your ecoregion, and you'll see that we have some species there, but you can do some searching. So I've been like researching some very particular species that are from my neck of the woods, and just to kind of really get to know nature. And it sounds kind of corny, and I don't mean walking in the park, because often the park is going to be curated Asian exotic species, which I love too, by the way, don't get me wrong. I love azaleas and rhododendrons, but like learn about the species that are really native and really the backbone of your ecoregion, because I think we're so disconnected from that. And just even beginning the process of learning about them, these different, and they could be insects as well, plants or insects or other animals that are particularly your area. Just it starts to create the relationship with the earth, because that's like, of all the things we have to do, we just don't have a relationship with the thing that gives us life. So we're seeking meaning and value in all these very disconnected, abstracted ways. And so I would say, like, just take some time to do that, and that's so, and I'm not saying that is a cliche, like it's actually work. You're going to probably have to go to your local university, and I even in Philadelphia where I am, where there's gardens and everywhere, and like it's been quite hard for me to learn, but it's taken me some time, and I've learned, and I'm planting these 10 species in my yard now that are going to help with the pollinators, because they're collapsing. The pollinators are collapsing as well as the vertebrates. We really need our pollinators, like moths and butterflies and bees and things like that, and wasps and bats. We need them desperately to live. So I'd say, yeah, just start to learn about them.
Learn and reconnect to nature. What a beautiful last and final word. Thank you so much, Karl, and have a nice day.
Thank you too. This was fun.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ismaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Be yourself, positive. Just another mindset.